Now, here's one for you that tends to confuse international audiences to no end. What is Irish Socialist Republicanism? In its simplest terms, Irish Socialist Republicanism is Irish republicanism infused with a strong class-based analysis. But that won't mean much if you don't already know what Irish republicanism is. Now, in the international context, republicanism is simply the rejection of monarchy and the divine right of kings, which could potentially include people from all across the political spectrum. In the Irish context, however, it takes on a much more radical meaning. In line with the revolutionary Irish Republic of 1919 to 1922 and its democratic programme, Irish republicanism is the egalitarian, anti-colonial, revolutionary national liberation struggle of the Irish people, primarily against British imperialism. Socialist republicanism takes its egalitarian goals one step further, following these ideas to their natural conclusions and recognising that the struggle for Irish national liberation needs to be based along class lines. Why does it need to be along class-based lines? Well, throughout Irish history, there has unfortunately been a trend of narrow nationalism which seeks to blur the lines between the ruling class and the working class, to unite the Irish nation, rich and poor together, against the British Empire. And this might sound great in theory, we're all united and in this struggle together. The problem is that we're not. The Irish ruling class often worked alongside and in alliance with the British ruling class to oppress fellow Irish people, rendering such notions of cross-class nationalist unity void. A perfect example of these class contradictions within the movement was when William Martin Murphy, an extremely wealthy business owner and self-proclaimed Irish nationalist, fought against the Irish workers, particularly those in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, who wanted better conditions during the 1913 Dublin Lock-Out. Note the wording here. This was a lockout, which is when an employer refuses entry to their workers until the workers give in to the employer's demands, not the other way around like with a normal workers' strike. This was class-based warfare from above, an attack from the wealthy business-owning ruling class elites on the workers, all of whom were supposed to be on the same side, united in their Irish nationality. This trade dispute, the largest in Irish history, clearly demonstrated the irreconcilable differences between the interests of the bourgeois ruling class nationalists and the proletarian working class nationalists. In other words, normal workers, employees, and the rich employers did not and do not share the same economic interests, despite both groups often claiming to be nationalists fighting against British colonial occupation of Ireland. So when you say you're a socialist Republican, you're committing to resolving this class antagonism within the Republican movement. People don't usually start at this position though. The most common trajectory that people follow is that they join the Irish Republican movement without a consistent class analysis, mostly in response to seeing the devastating impact of British imperialism on this country. This is where people can sometimes get caught in the Brits out stage and they might erroneously see individuals as the main problem rather than the systems of oppression and exploitation which create them. Republicans then generally advance in their political development and gain class consciousness as they begin to see the class contradictions in the movement for themselves and naturally progress into socialist republicanism. Now, socialist republicanism is primarily associated with the great revolutionary hero James Connolly, given that he was the first one to formally synthesise in his writing the two main radical traditions within Ireland, namely socialism and left-wing nationalism or republicanism. It's tempting to suggest that this is where socialist republicanism began, but actually, the history of socialist republicanism can be traced back as far as the late 1700s with the United Irishmen and the father of Irish republicanism, Wolfe Tone, who of course emphasised the revolutionary importance of the men of no property. But it was Tone's comrade in the United Irishmen, Jemmy, who really put forward that working class analysis within the early Republican movement. In his organising, he would target manufacturers, business owners and landowners, and he recognised them as being the enemies of all those who fought for freedom and liberation. Really a proto-Marxist figure who was decades ahead of his time. So even from the very beginning of the Republican movement, we can see that there was always this key strand that moved beyond that narrow, Brits-out approach to revolutionary activity in Ireland. And this class-conscious strand carried through to the Young Irelanders uprising in the 1840s during the Great Famine with James Fintan Lalor, an agrarian revolutionary who was very concerned with land reform and tenants' rights against the more liberal republicanism of the other Young Irelanders. Interestingly, Lalor was coming to the same conclusions as Marx was around this same time, but completely independently of the international socialist movement. Then of course, James Connolly came along in the latter half of the century and would finally use the term socialist republicanism to describe this particularly class-conscious tradition within the Irish Republican movement. Now, sometimes people ask, what kind of socialism did he espouse for socialist republicanism? Well, Connolly was explicitly a Marxist who fought for a workers' republic. He was very active in the trade union movement and a member of the IWW, so sometimes people use this to suggest he was some form of a syndicalist, and he certainly may have held his sympathies for that, but he never rejected political party organisation, government or the state. He also never centred his politics around the idea of dismantling hierarchies, aside from occasional jabs at monarchists. Actually, his ideology led him to many of the same conclusions as Vladimir Lenin, seeing the need for what was essentially a militant revolutionary vanguard to bring about the workers' state, which was embodied in the form of the Irish Citizen Army, or ICA, sometimes called the First Red Army in Europe. Personally, I find it extremely difficult to read Connolly as anything other than a Marxist-Leninist before the ideology formally existed. And this is reflected in the modern Socialist Republicans who generally base their ideology around Marxism-Leninism as applied to the unique conditions of Ireland, or some variation thereof. For example, the Irish Republican Socialist Party and the Irish National Liberation Army, the Communist Party of Ireland, the Workers' Party, CIRU, groups like the Irish Socialist Republicans and Anti-Imperialist Action, etc., all of whom fight for our workers' republic. Modern Socialist Republicans have of course developed and expanded their analysis beyond opposition to British imperialism alone. We now focus on the triple lock of imperialism in Ireland from the United Kingdom, the European Union and the United States of America, and we fight against all three in equal measures. Keep in mind that this is using Lenin's definition of imperialism rather than just using it as a synonym for settler colonialism. Perhaps most importantly, as Socialist Republicans, we reaffirm our allegiance to the revolutionary Irish Republic of 1919 to 1922 and its 1919 Democratic Programme, a phenomenal text which called for collective ownership of the means of production, a dictatorship of the proletariat, and a pledge to support the international working class movement, or the socialist movement, though it did most of these things without actually using the explicit terms. In fact, the first version of the document was actually censored by some of the more moderate revolutionaries for being too communistic. This programme has unfortunately not yet been followed through on due to the bourgeois counter-revolution of the pro-treaty Free Staters from 1921 onwards. But it's our goal as Socialist Republicans to make sure that it will be one day. I'll put a link to the programme in the description box below so you can have a read of it yourself. So that's it. Irish Socialist Republicanism is Marxism as applied to the unique Irish conditions. Class-conscious republicanism. Thanks to Michaela Schmid, Rare Hero, William Leach and the rest of my patrons. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous. Cheers everyone, slán go fóill.